Okay, so welcome to the lecture on chapter 13. So this is confusing because this is the eighth lecture in the class, but it refers to chapter 13. We are not doing chapter 8. We're jumping ahead. Lecture 9 will be on chapter 14, and the final lecture, lecture 10, will be on chapter 15. So this chapter addresses global inequalities, more specifically class and rural-urban inequalities globally. So in the introduction, it points out that there are great economic inequalities between and among societies, which raise moral and ethical concerns, but also represent a major source of instability and conflict in many areas of the world. So a guiding question is, does globalization contribute to greater inequality in the world, or does it represent the great hope for reducing that inequality? So some people have pointed out that this inequality is corresponding to the fact that economic globalization is capitalist in nature, and capitalism by nature leads to inequality because there is a growing divide between the capitalists that own the means of production and workers who, through their exploitation, profit is derived. So as a profit driven economic system, that profit comes from mainly undercompensating labor and workers for the value they create and instead compensating them based on their time. And by doing that, people that own the means of production are able to accumulate that profit value. So that is going to, over time, lead to massive economic inequality. However, some people, another way of looking at it though, is that for capitalism to thrive, workers are also consumers. So it's bad for business when workers are not paid living wages and are not paid enough to be good consumers. So there is an incentive built into the capitalist system to keep the standard of living for workers, high enough that they can participate in a consumer society. So more about class inequality. So social class, sometimes social or economic class, relates to social rankings made on the basis of economic factors such as occupation, wealth, and income. So typically, when we look at class in a society, we're referring to the upper classes, the middle classes, and the working classes. But sometimes, like if sociologists want to look particularly at the middle class, they might make further distinctions such as upper middle class, lower middle class, middle class. And working classes can be divided into, classes that are living in poverty versus those that are just lower class or approaching lower middle class. So there can be further distinctions, but as you know, that's a pretty basic distinction. If you're interested on learning about social class and thinking about social class in the United States, a really fascinating documentary is People Like Us, which is available on Canopy, which I sometimes show in other classes. It's a really fascinating look at social class in the United States. So, it's worth noting globally that more of the upper classes are in North America, Europe, and increasingly Asia, while a disproportionate number of those in the lower classes are in Africa and South America. Of course, there is a lot of poverty in the North, and there is some affluence in the global South, but this is the general pattern, which is why typically the North is associated with more privilege and the South globally with disadvantage. So, inequality in the world system. So, just a review, we've approached world systems theory before, which envisions a world divided between the core, which would be like the global north, the periphery, which would be developing nations, and semi-periphery, which would be more like nations that are more developed than developing nations, but not quite at the level of power and influence of nations like the United States or some European countries. The earlier a country became integrated in the capitalist world economy, the more rapidly it accumulated wealth. So we've talked before about how Countries at the semi-periphery or periphery look like countries in the core at previous moments in the core's development. That it seems like each country goes through a similar process as they move up to the core. But it also seems like arguably people that engage in world systems theory argue that the core is dependent on keeping some countries in the periphery and semi-periphery. Like that's like actually intentional. Um, Although this has also meant that inequality increased rapidly within those countries. That within the core, there is also extreme inequality. And we'll talk about some of that within the United States in a later slide in this lecture. And many people have pointed out, even though overt colonialism has ended, there are power relations, post-colonial power relations, which continue through global finance institutions. So we've talked before about how the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, in order to give out loans to developing nations, require those nations to meet certain neoliberal standards, and therefore the countries that are more powerful in these international institutions can control policy and economic and social policy in less developed countries. The bottom billion. So this is the most impoverished billion of people on the planet. 70% live in Africa, but also Haiti, Bolivia, Laos, North Korea, and Yemen. So some characteristics of the bottom billion is that they have a low life expectancy, about 50 years. They have high infant mortality, so 14% die before their 5th birthday, and malnutrition can be as high as 36%. So the book discussed 4 traps that differentiate nation states that disproportionately account for the impoverishment of the bottom billion. So one caveat or limitation of these 4 traps is that sometimes it's set up to sort of be victim blaming, that it's sort of claiming that the bottom billion is responsible for its plight rather than the fact that it's part of the bottom billion because of larger global dynamics that have situated these nation states within these 4 traps. So the first is called the conflict trap, which is continuing civil wars or frequent violent coups d'etats. So that'd be like in Congo or Rwanda or Sudan. The natural resources trap, where ironically, poor countries are often rich in natural resources, but dependence on them militates against broader economic development or other forms of production. They develop really vulnerable economies that are dependent on one staple natural resource or a few staple natural resources rather than a more diversified manufacturing economy, for example. And also, what's not said is the fact that they are often rich in natural resources brings in more wealthy countries to use those natural resources and exploit the poorer countries for those natural resources at the expense of those living in that region. There's also the trap of being landlocked with bad neighbors. So the unavailability of transportation to coasts and the fact that neighbors or surrounding regions are often too poor or unstable to provide markets for things that are manufactured or produced, or natural resources that are produced within these countries, also continue a vicious cycle of impoverishment. The bad governance trap is just that bad policies can destroy the economy in a region too. That we all know that the government of a given region and their economic policies can reverberate throughout a given region, and there are several examples of that given in your textbook. Growing global inequality in health and healthcare. So poor health can be a result of limited access to health services, education, even just basic things like sanitation and adequate nutrition and housing, which also lead to lower productivity, which make it harder to be a productive worker in the global capitalist economy. This is really astonishing. 90% of the total burden of disease in the world is concentrated in low and middle income countries, which account for only 10% of healthcare expenditures. I want to talk a little bit about the US specifically because there is a lot of controversial conversation going on about our healthcare system. So the US spends most in the world on healthcare, but it ranks significantly lower than other developed countries on a number of public health indicators. Americans tend to live shorter lives, are more likely to experience violent deaths, are more likely to be obese, and have many higher disease rates. We have a healthcare system that is not very efficient and has poor health outcomes compared to other countries of similar economic rank. Unlike all other developed countries in the world, many of its citizens, especially Americans with low incomes, do not have health coverage. So I just want to give you a basic explanation of how healthcare works in the United States and how it works in other developed countries. All other developed countries have what's called socialized healthcare, where the healthcare industry is not privately owned, it's government run because it's not for profit. No one is profiting in these countries off of illness and disease. Instead of paying an insurance premium to a private insurance company for healthcare, people in developed countries pay a lower amount than they would to private insurance because it's not for profit, but they pay in taxes a certain amount that ensures them full health coverage, usually without any even co-pays or anything. They do not have to worry about affording health care, and instead they pay higher taxes. But again, since these are government-run healthcare systems and they're not for profit, the people are not paying in their taxes for things like advertising. So think about in the United States, we have private healthcare and it's for profit. So people profit off of sickness and disease in the United States. And instead of paying the government a certain amount in taxes to guarantee healthcare as a right, we have to pay for private insurance. And some people can't afford that. And most people get that through their employer, but employment is not a guarantee. And some people that are employed are not given health coverage. Even I myself that teach college courses, I'm an adjunct instructor, I'm a part-time instructor. I do not have health care through my employer. I have to seek health care elsewhere. So with the exception, though, in the United States of Medicaid and Medicare. So if Americans meet certain requirements economically that they cannot afford, like extreme poverty, if you're living in extreme poverty and you cannot afford health care coverage, you are covered under Medicaid, which is run like sort of the socialized health care of other developed countries where it's government provided healthcare that is funded through taxes, the taxes of everybody. Similarly is also Medicare. So if you are over, I think it's 65, if you are over 65, you qualify for Medicare, which is another government-run healthcare system like the healthcare systems of all other developed countries in the world. Now, you've heard a lot of probably statements about Obamacare, either favorable or unfavorable. So what Obamacare did is, what they mean by Obamacare is the Affordable Care Act. So under President Obama, they passed the Affordable Care Act, which meant that if you did not buy health insurance, you would have to pay, I think it was like a couple $100s in your taxes as a penalty. And what that did was that enabled the government in what's called the marketplace to offer more affordable private insurance plans that enabled a lot of people to get on healthcare that wouldn't have been. I myself would not have been on healthcare for the first few years that I was an adjunct instructor unless I was provided with a marketplace plan. So that's how I was able to get health insurance. So Obamacare, a lot of people are against it because it penalizes healthy people that don't want to pay for health insurance at all, a few $100s. But the upside was it gave a lot of people access to health coverage that otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford it in the private market. Before Obamacare, if you did not receive healthcare coverage through an employer, you could buy a private policy, but these policies were astronomically expensive, like over $1,000 premium a month. Like nobody could afford them hardly. So the debate today is whether we continue with privatized healthcare and a for-profit healthcare system, or we join all other developed countries in the world and have some sort of socialized healthcare where you would pay in higher taxes, but you wouldn't have to pay for health insurance at all, and you wouldn't have to worry about certain doctors being out of network or a lot of other concerns. And many people think that if healthcare is not for profit, then it'll be higher quality healthcare. And like the other developed countries that outrank us in healthcare outcomes do have socialized healthcare. And the idea is that in a for-profit healthcare system, the goal is profit, not healing you. So actually, sometimes the healthcare system in the United States is set up that less costly preventative measures are discouraged. They want you to have, like a heart attack or something and have to have an expensive surgery because they'll make more money off of your illness if instead of preventative care, they have to give you really invasive treatments. So that's one theory for how we could improve our healthcare outcomes. So the big debate is whether to continue with private insurance and a for-profit healthcare system, or replace that with socialized healthcare like other developed countries. And the term that they use for healthcare that would be socialized in the United States, I've heard, is Medicare for all, or universal healthcare coverage. Another thing to point out in the United States is that we are also one of the most economically unequal countries out of developed countries. So I just found on this website some statistics that we can look at to look at really astounding facts about wealth inequality in the United States. So this is information about total wealth. So wealth is your accumulated total wealth, not your income. Your income is how much you make a year. Wealth is your accumulation of wealth over a period of time. So this is shocking. The three richest men and they're all men in the United States, own as much wealth as the bottom half of Americans. So the bottom half of Americans have over $250 billion. That's the total accumulated wealth of the bottom 50% of citizens in the United States. The top three individuals, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, own significantly more than that. They own almost $350 billion just across three individuals. This is really shocking. Also, wealth concentration has spiked in recent decades, and I put the link to this website so you can look at some of these. The richest American in 2018 was worth 30 times as much as in 1982. So this has been, income inequality has been accelerating over time. Some more. The richest 5% of Americans own 2/3 of the total wealth in the United States. And the last thing I want to look at is the richest 1% own more than half of stocks. So when we look at the stock market as a measure for how the economy is doing, many people argue that's sort of a classist way of looking at it, because how the stock market is doing is not a measure of how the majority of Americans are doing. And then there's some information on the racial wealth gap that you can look at on this website too. So you can access this website through this link here on this PowerPoint. The global digital divide. So the number of online users in the South, the global South, is negligible, whereas in the North it is near 80%. So the vast majority, over 80% of web pages are also in English, which makes that very convenient for people in the United States and people in the global north that speak European languages and have been taught English. E-waste and inequality. Electronics are laced with all sorts of hazardous and toxic materials, and it's cheaper to process in less developed countries that therefore have more dangerous jobs in the production of these electronics. And we also get rid of our e-waste in less developed countries. We export that e-waste to less developed countries and give these dangerous jobs to people over there. So this is something that, think about how dependent we all are for the internet in our lives. You are all taking an online class, so you all have access to the internet. So I'm assuming all of you have access to the internet outside of this class, and think about how transformed your life has been and how dependent you are on the internet. And imagine that, in the South, that's virtually negligible. Hardly anybody has access to the internet. Only the extremely wealthy do. Is global economic inequality increasing or decreasing? So some argue that globalization is increasing global inequality, while others contend it is decreasing such inequality. There are aging populations in the North, which might bring the North's productivity down, while the South experiences an increase in working age populations. So many people look at that statistic, the statistics of aging in the North and South, and think that there's some hope there for having the South catch up to the North economically. And a big question is, does development lead to modernization and less inequality? So people look at the extreme inequality in the United States. The levels of income and wealth inequality in the United States are on par with that of undeveloped or less developed nations. So many people look at that as evidence that this assumption is circumspect. Rural-urban inequality. So in this chapter, rural is referring specifically to agricultural areas in the South. Something I would like to add as a side note is that rural people are often marginalized globally, but in the United States, actually, if you are living in a rural area, because of the way the Electoral College is structured and the Senate is structured, your vote matters more. So, for example, in the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump lost the popular vote. If it was just every vote was equal in value, and there was no Electoral College, Hillary Clinton would be president. Donald Trump would have lost. But Hillary Clinton's votes were concentrated in urban areas where there's a higher population density, but the way the Electoral College is structured, people living in cities, their vote matters less. So if you live in Wyoming or in a rural area, your vote matters more because of the way the Electoral College is structured. So even though Donald Trump lost the popular vote, he had over 2 million less votes than Hillary Clinton. He was elected because he had the rural vote. And also the Senate gives rural constituents more power, because think about it. California has 2 senators, and so does Montana. And think about the population disparity between those two regions. And yet in the Senate, those 2 regions, despite their population differences, hold as much power within the Senate. So a lot of people say that politically, landowners and rural voters are actually advantaged in the United States politically, not necessarily economically. Economically, that is a very different story. This divide is a result globally. The rural divide is a result of new relations of agricultural production. So there's been the rise of global agribusiness, which has been dominated by the North, particularly the U.S., and factory farming. So the South produces for the North, therefore producing and consuming less of their own traditional products. This led to a global convergence on a diet that includes a narrowing base of staple grains, increased consumption of animal protein, edible oils, and salt and sugar, and a decline in dietary fiber. So it's sort of like this westernization has also sometimes included a particular diet that we have in the United States and in Western Europe, which is high on animal protein and fats and edible oils and salt and sugar, and we eat less fruits and vegetables than other people did before sort of the export of this diet. And this is a shocking reality. Obesity has come to be as common throughout the world as malnutrition because of this particular diet. And I know some people are sensitive to, like, people that are involved in the body positive movement and the fat positive movement and the health at any size movement, like to acknowledge that sometimes obesity itself is not a good indicator of health, and that some people that are technically, their weight qualifies as obese might still be healthy. And often obesity is a sign or a byproduct of other behaviors that lead to a decline in health. So, like, obesity is often a sign that you are consuming food and in quantities and types of food that are harmful to your body, and that is what's harming you, not the obesity itself. But of course, obesity can lead to immobility, and fat tissue surrounding the heart can lead to, sort of heart disease and heart trouble. So there are indications of this does have a correlation to health in the United States and elsewhere globally. Rural relations of social production. So how populations survive within international and national institutions that govern material conditions and opportunities to earn a livelihood. There's a shift from local solutions of problems relating to food issues to those solutions being put in the hands of global processes of social reproduction. These changes in the South have not eliminated poverty and hunger, but have led to a change from poverty, which is hunger amidst scarcity, to poverty and hunger amidst abundance. Relations of resistance. Consumer, farmer, farm worker, farmer peasant, and indigenous peasant movements have existed to sort of resist this rise of global agribusiness, and food is the core of new relations of resistance to globalization around the world. A lot of people are fighting against this kind of dangerous and unhealthy diet that's been exported globally with Western capitalism, and are using the fight against that diet and the fight against agribusiness as a major site of resistance against globalization more generally. So urban areas. Between 2000 and 2010, a watershed moment occurred where the urban population outnumbered the rural. Some cities are seen as cosmopolitan, so seen as citizens of the world or citizens of the universe, rather than just citizens of a particular nation state, and therefore inherently global. The three cities that are considered global cities that term is used for are New York, London, and Tokyo. Megacities are defined as cities with continuous urban development and a population greater than 10 million people. So this would be Jakarta in Indonesia, Seoul in South Korea, Delhi in India, Shanghai in China, and Manila in the Philippines. A megapolis is a long chain of interconnected cities with the potentiality of becoming one huge city. So in the United States, the region of Boston through New York City to DC could become a megapolis in the future, and in California, San Diego to San Francisco. So review questions. Explain the 4 traps that confront the bottom billion, and how does globalization affect these traps? What is a limitation of this explanation for the plight of the bottom billion? And I'll give you a hint. A limitation has to do with sort of the victim blaming mentality that sometimes goes with this, that is unrealistic. Explain how economic class tends to be distributed in the global north and south. What is the global digital divide? And explain 2 examples of inequality in health and healthcare globally and or domestically.